Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue our discussion talking about the brain and kind of some of the accessory features of the brain. So this particular chapter is talking about the brain, some of the different brain structures, some of the different brain functions. And then we also talk about the cranial nerves, which we talked a little bit about in chapter 8, I think, or maybe 7. We're talking about muscles and the muscles of the face and the muscles that generate facial expression. The reason we're talking about that is because these are the nerves that are essentially going to be sending signals to those different muscular features to allow facial expressions to occur. Okay, so just a quick rundown, reminder of what you have to do, where we're going. Make sure you've answered the study guide questions for chapter 14. Your quiz for chapter 14 is due Friday at midnight. We have 2 classes left after today, and when I say today, I mean today right now is Monday, so when you are watching this, maybe there's only 1 class left, we'll see. November 23rd is our final from 3:20 to 5:20. There are 80 multiple choice questions on that. It'll be cumulative. We do still have exam 3 coming up, not this Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. That will be our last class meeting time will be that exam 3. And that exam 3 will be primarily over the nervous system. Chapter 10 is showing up on my Wiley Plus. That is an extra credit assignment. So you have both the quiz and the homework for chapter 10 that can be done for extra credit. And then the writing assignment is due this Friday, November 13th as well. If you have any questions about the writing assignment, you can see the syllabus. And if you have more specific questions than the syllabus really goes over, feel free to just send me an email. No problemo. I will get back to you about that. Okay, study guide questions. This looks like study guide questions from part 1, so we'll have to fix that and make sure that this is actually part 2. Oh, here we go. Study guide questions for part 2. So you have your cranial nerves. We'll be talking extensively about cranial nerves. We'll finish up by talking about brain development and about the effects of aging and that the types of disorders that affect the brain and cranial nerves, which I feel like will be a pretty abbreviated list. Cranial nerves. Okay, so we think about the brain being up here, doing its like little brain thing, making our bodies move in very specific ways. Cranial nerves are the nerves that extend kind of from out the bottom of our brain near the brainstem, and then kind of again innervate both the face and the shoulders and the upper arm. So it's like all of this up here that's very important for us to be kind of using. So the cranial nerves are numbered, but then they also have names associated with them. And often the names are going to be helping you in terms of where these cranial nerves are functioning. So let's go through these kind of one by one. So cranial nerve 1 is going to be your olfactory cranial nerve. Olfaction, kind of like we went over for chapter 14, part 1. Olfaction is your sense of smell. So luckily they put that there as well. Cranial nerve 2 is a special sensory nerve component that innervates vision or your sight. You'll notice that there are going to be a lot of nerves that go to your eye and are dedicated to vision. Cranial nerve 3, ocular motor. So ocular, always think eye, motor, think movement. So this particular cranial nerve is important for movement of the muscles that move the eye and also adjust the lens for near vision. So not just the muscles that move the eye, but also some of the nerves within the eye that allow for contraction or constriction of the pupil. Cranial nerve 4 is motor and somatic, which again aids in the movement of the eyeball. It's pretty amazing how many different nerves go to our eyes to allow us to get full function and range of the movement there. So think of ocular motor 3, trochlear 4, both moving the eyeball. The trigeminal cranial nerve, which is cranial nerve 5, it has a couple of mixed components to it. So its functions in touch, pain, thermal sensations of the scalp, face, and oral cavity. And so again, it's a lot of our face and has somatosensory type of information that are coming in. It also has some motor function and importance in chewing and controls of the middle ear muscle. Cranial nerve 6, which is abducens. It's a somatic component. It helps with movements of the eyeball. So I think, again, if you just wrote down eyeball and then started writing down the different cranial nerves, that might be one of the better ways to kind of figure out which ones have to know are dedicated to the eyeball, and then just kind of all the rest are dedicated to different things. here you have cranial nerve 7, which is facial. For the sensory information, it has taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, touch, pain, and thermal sensations from the skin and an internal ear canal. And then in terms of the motor, it has muscles of the facial expression and middle ear muscle, and then also secretion of saliva and tears. So facial cranial muscle 7 is facial. Cranial nerve 8 is vestibulocochlear. Cochlear, think of cochlea, ear. So this is very important for hearing and equilibrium. So if there's any kind of damage to this region or to this particular nerve, it could affect things like balance and kind of, if it's really damaged, it could lead to things like vertigo, kind of like a constant spinning. And so that's why it's so important and located in the ear. Okay. Cranial nerve 9 is mixed. It has sensory outputs or processing from taste of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, proprioception of some swallowing muscles, monitors things like blood pressure, oxygen, and does some touch, pain, and thermal sensations from both the ear and upper pharynx. And then for motor, kind of outputs it assists in swallowing and secretion of saliva. So glossopharyngeal, pharyngeal, think kind of throat. Oops. And then 10 is the vagus nerve. So this has a lot to do with taste from the epiglottis, again, located within our throats, proprioception from the throat and voice box muscles, monitors blood pressure and oxygen, carbon dioxide levels in blood, sensations from the thoracic and abdominal organs, motor, it's important output for swallowing, vocalization, and coughing. And then for autonomic functions, it has assists in motility and secretion of gastrointestinal organs and constriction of respiratory pathways and decreases heart rate. So the vagus, again, has probably a little bit more autonomic function than we've seen with any of these previous cranial nerves. And don't get too bogged down. I'm giving you kind of a laundry list of the functions of these cranial nerves, but then our subsequent slides are going to go into each one of these a little bit more. Okay, so again, there are 12 cranial nerves. That's 10. And now let's go over 11 and 12. 11 is accessory, which is movement of the head and pectoral girdle. And then hypoglossal is 12, which is motor, and that's important for speech, manipulation of food, and swallowing. So again, 12 cranial nerves. Many of the functions are located in the head. Many of them are for facial features. Some of them are for food and swallowing and mastication. Others are for eye functions. So just, again, take some time and maybe just put together a table similar to this, but one that makes sense to you in terms of which cranial nerve has which function. Okay, so a mnemonic for the cranial nerves, because again, memorization is important. So it's important to just kind of find a mnemonic device that works for you. So the mnemonic device that is provided here. So O, to touch and feel very green vegetables. So that would be olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory hypoglossal. So this is just one, possible mnemonic device, but coming up with a mnemonic device that makes sense to you, makes you laugh, makes you remember, very important. So that might be something that I have you do during one of our class periods. Is come up with an appropriate mnemonic device that'll help you remember these cranial nerves. Okay, so first let's start with olfactory. So your olfactory cranial nerve is important for your sense of smell. So when we were looking at earlier structures of the brain, you could see here these things called olfactory bulbs. What's interesting is olfactory bulbs are pretty big on a human. If you do enough dissections in mice, you'll see that mice have huge olfactory bulbs, again, because it's so important for their survival, but they're located kind of right at the bottom in the base of the brain as you extract it. And so here you can see the olfactory bulb and it's extending back the olfactory tract. And then if you go even further, so here you go, your olfactory bulb, your olfactory tract, and you have an olfactory nerve that is going to be sending sensory information from your olfactory bulb into your olfactory receptor region area for processing of olfaction. So this is essentially just the cross section that you see here between this skull and the extension of the olfactory nerve back into that region, important for processing or olfaction that we saw in some of the previous slides. So olfactory epithelium, cribriform plate, which is essentially the region of the skull, and then you have your olfactory bulb kind of located and tucked right underneath that there. Again, if you are a person who likes kind of more visual dynamic images, there is a video. Your second cranial nerve is your optic. And so if we look at your second cranial nerve, you can see that here, again, you can see kind of where I pointed out the olfactory bulbs. Well, kind of inferior to that, you're going to see your olfactory projections. They actually cross one another here. It's called the optic chiasm. They kind of make an X right at the very base of your brain. And that is going to extend back the optic tract. So you can see the optic nerve 2 here is getting input from your eyeball, right? You're getting all this input in from through the lens, extending back into the retina of the eyeball, then it's sending that information through the optic nerve. So if we look at the very back of the eyeball, where all of you're this light, all of the vision not processing, but all of the light and all of the information is being projected. If we do a cross section of that and basically kind of blow it up, you can see here how exactly your vision processing, or how your initial visual processing happens. So you can see the axons of the ganglions, you can see rods and cones and bipolar cells and ganglion cells. These are all different cell types that are important for vision. We're not going to go through exactly what rods and cones do, but they have different purposes in terms of detecting things like both color as well as disparities between edges, light and darks. So again, if you're interested in this, by all means, please take a neuroscience class. We will talk about this ad nauseum, but I don't necessarily know. I don't think we're going to get into that level of detail here at this point. So again, if you're interested in the optic nerve, watch this video. Okay, next you have the ocular motor nerve. So the ocular motor nerve, we're talking about kind of function. Really just look at the word and break down what it's doing, right? Ocular, eye, motor, movement, right? And so not surprisingly, what you can see here is that the ocular motor nerve is going to send projections into the muscles surrounding the eye. So many of these muscles we've already kind of discussed in previous chapters, like the superior rectus muscle, the medial rectus muscle, the superior oblique muscle. So you can see that the ocular motor nerve is innervating the superior rectus, the medial rectus, the inferior rectus are all getting projections from this the ocular motor nerve. Now, we'll kind of jump ahead to some of the other nerves that we'll be talking about. Things like the trochlear nerve are going to be innervating the superior oblique muscle, and then the abducens, which is the cranial nerve 6, is going to be innervating the lateral rectus muscle. So you can see here there are 3 different cranial nerves that are innervating our eyes to essentially assist in eye movements. So it's definitely worth kind of looking at those individually and making notes as to which nerve is innervating which ocular muscle. Okay, the trochlear cranial nerve 4. So here you can see, as we just saw in our previous slide, the innervation of the trochlear nerve into the superior or oblique muscle. Trigeminal. So the trigeminal nerve, you can see here, is extending into the face, into the musculature of the face. So we see the ophthalmic branch. Whenever you see optic, you should think eye. So this is up into the regions of the more superior face region. Here you have your maxillar branch. Again, maxillar kind of correlates to where our maxillum is, the underlying bone structure. And then you have your mandibular branch, again, which is going to assist in things like mastication. That branch that you have here is a trigeminal ganglion, and it's helping assist down and branching into, again, mandibular region. So you think of trigeminal nerve, you think it's very much innervating muscles of the face and allowing for things like both expression as well as mastication. Okay, abducens. So we just saw this figure not too many slides ago, right? We've been going over the different innervations of the eye muscle. So you have your ocular motor, you have your trochlear, and lastly, you have your abducens. Your abducens nerve is going to innervate your lateral rectus muscle. So it's interesting, again, just to note that you have different muscles that are being innervated by different cranial nerves that allow for eye movements in different directions. So as you're going through this, it's always worth thinking about, okay, which nerve innervates which muscle, and what does that muscle allow the eye to do? Because then if you're able to do that kind of reasoning, you can essentially say, okay, well, I met with somebody and they weren't able to move their eye to the left or the right, right? Which muscle of the eye allows them to do that? And is there a possibility of an upstream nerve to the cranial nerve that innervates that particular muscle? So again, just kind of thinking ahead of like how you would actually use this information in a practical sense. Okay, so we're halfway done with the cranial nerves. Okay, so cranial nerve 7, facial. So this again kind of intuitively tells you what this nerve is, where it's innervating and possibly part of its function. So cranial nerve 7, you have innervation to the superior inferior part regions of the face. You can see it also goes internally and affects things like the tongue and salivary glands. So it has some more autonomic types of innervations that we see here. So again, that facial nerve is extending into both external and internal projections of the face. The vestibular cochlear, in the introduction, we talked about this, how this cranial nerve is extending out into the regions of the ear. It's going to be interacting with both the cochlea. If you hear cochlear, you should definitely think ear. This is going to serve a function, both auditory processing, as well as in balance. So you think of that middle ear canal, very important for balance, awareness of your environment. And so if you have any damage to that region, it's going to lead to things like vertigo. And so again, vestibular cochlear is going to innervate that region of both the cochlear and vestibular region. Okay. Cranial nerve 9, we have the glossopharyngeal. So you have your glossopharyngeal nerve that's kind of extending out into your superior ganglion as well as your inferior ganglion. And those are going to hit parts of the lower, more inferior regions of the face. So you have here it innervating your parotoid gland, your as well as your palatine tonsil, your soft palate, your carotid body, your carotid sinus, as well as your tongue. So a lot of the glossopharyngeal will assist in things like, again, mastication, parts of your voice box, and as well as your ability to swallow. Okay, your vagus nerve. Vagus nerve, kind of an important nerve as you can see here. Again, innervating a lot of different regions that are important for autonomic functions. So you can see here the vagus nerve innervating regions like the heart, the larynx, the lungs, the liver and gallbladder, the stomach, the large intestines, the small intestines. So the vagus nerve, the cranial nerve 10, it's a lot of different, I guess, larger organ systems, and it really does help the brain communicate with these larger organ systems, especially in an autonomic function, because again, autonomic, automatic, a lot of these different organ systems function in an automatic manner. Okay, your accessory nerve, again, we talked about how this is important for head movement. So here you can see it's innervating the sternocleidomastoid muscle, again, very important for head movement, as well as the trapezius muscle. And the hypoglossal, which is cranial nerve 12, important for innervating the muscles that are important for mastication. So here you can see the different regions of the face. We've talked about some of these before, part of the zygomaticus muscle, as well as some of the internal structures of mastication as well. Okay, so those are the 12 cranial muscles, very abbreviated introduction to them. If it makes the most sense to you to go back to the table and just learn some parts of the regions of the table, thinking about, what the cranial nerve number is, what the name of the cranial nerve is, where it's innervating, and then kind of lastly, thinking about the functions of it. What types of normal physiological processes are the cranial nerves mediating? Okay, so next we'll talk a little bit about the development of the nervous system. So the nervous system starts off as essentially a tube, and we'll talk about what this tube is essentially called. and then slowly over time differentiates into specialized regions. So when I use the word differentiate, I basically mean that you have a cell that doesn't necessarily have a strong identity, well, has an identity, but doesn't have a strong identity of what its final function is. And so what happens over time is that cell gets a set of signals that says, okay, well, you're going to be this type of cell. And so once it gets a set of signals, it starts to develop more of the characteristics of that cell type. The nervous system specifically has, a lot of specialized cells and functions. Obviously, the entire body, most cells have very specialized, structures and functions. But in the nervous system, it's very important that everything kind of ends up where it needs to be, because kind of everything needs to work in a concerted effort. So again, when I use the word differentiate, I'm basically talking about a cell starting from one type of cell and becoming another type of cell. And that cell that it becomes is a little bit more specialized in its function. And sometimes that differentiation continues to evolve, and it'll eventually get into the final cell state that it's going to depend on. So an interesting thing about the nervous system is it's one of the few parts of the body that's able to kind of, I use the word evolve very loosely, but it's able to adapt to its environment. It's able to adapt and change over time. And so we see that even in terms of the way that it develops in the beginning. Okay, so in the 3rd week of gestation, the ectoderm part of the nervous system thickens and forms essentially a neural plate. So you've got this plate of nervous cell tissue. Now the neural plate is going to fold inward and forms this essentially a longitudinal groove. So essentially, you have this, it's almost like you're, has anybody ever made like, almost like noodles? You just make one flat and then you're folding it over. You're making one long noodle. On either side of the groove, the raised edges are called neural folds. Eventually, the folds are going to meet up to cause the neural tube. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like. So again, you've got your very flat plate. And so then you have your neural plate here, your neural folds that kind of fold up on each side. And once it comes and meets towards the center, then you have your neural tube. And then if we kind of look down the transverse section of this neural tube, you can see the notochord as this center here, your endoderm and your ectoderm. So endoderm is kind of inside, ectoderm is a little bit outside. This is your future neural crest that you see here and your neural plate. So from there, your neural folds kind of fold up and eventually are going to form what's called the neural tube. So again, this is just kind of on the more dorsal region of the fetus. So again, you have your future neural crest, your neural plate essentially folds over, causes neural folds, and then eventually meets and creates a neural tube. Okay, so once the neural tube is formed, then you start to see it differentiate into kind of 3 different regions that are going to continue to develop into different subregions. So you have your proencephalon, which eventually will become your forebrain, your mesencephalon, which is your midbrain, and your rhombencephalon, which is your hindbrain. So this is, again, very early on in development. You can see here a very, very young, early developing eye, your pharyngeal arches, as well as your developing heart and your spinal cord located here at the very bottom. So again, this is very early on in development. This is 3 to 4 week old embryo. Now, if we kind of fast forward to 7 weeks, you can see here the diencephalon, the telencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the metaencephalon, and the myelencephalon. So I'm kind of going, from more superior to inferior. The telencephalon is going to eventually become your frontal lobe, your diencephalon, again, midbrain, your hindbrain, and so on and so forth. So we continue to develop into an 11-week-old. Here you have the outline of the diencephalon located here. You can see previously it was kind of found in this region that you see here. Your cerebral hemisphere kind of developed from your telencephalon. Your midbrain developed from your mesencephalon. Your cerebellum is again the result of that metaencephalon. And then your things like your pons, medulla oblongata, your myencephalon, essentially was the origin of those. And then lastly, you see your spinal cord there at the very bottom. So again, you can see these different regions are essentially growing and changing and becoming more differentiated and looking kind of like their final states. So sometimes it's easier to kind of go to what the final state was because that's the way you kind of know and think of these different regions, and then kind of work your way back from there. Be like, oh, okay, the cerebral hemisphere comes from what part, and then what is that originally? So you can think of like the cerebral hemisphere, your intact cerebral hemisphere as you see it here came from your telencephalon in your 7-week-old, and then in your 3 to 4-week-old was your proencephalon. So here you see at birth kind of the overall structure that's been put together: your cerebral hemisphere, your diencephalon, your cerebellum, your brainstem, midbrain pons, medulla oblongata, and your spinal cord. If any of those words seem foreign to you, please go back and watch the first lecture for this week, because you should hopefully have some semblance of recognition for all of those different brain regions. And you should definitely have maybe a word or two of function that pops to your mind as I'm saying those different regions as well. Okay. So aging and the nervous system. Okay, so as we've been going through all of the different systems this semester, we've slowly but surely hit upon the idea that aging does not bode well for the human body. Things tend to kind of fall apart, and the nervous system is no exception to that. As you age, you do lose neurons. There's just no way around it. You have loss of neurons as you get older. That's part of the reason we see some of the cognitive deficits in older individuals that we see. Recognize, your neurons kind of peak out at your peak learning capacity as a young adult. And then we basically just do our hardest to either destroy, zap, or stun, or just allow them to degenerate over time. One thing that'll be said, and if you watch one of the lectures that I posted additionally to this, something that can stimulate new neural development is exercise that causes what's called neurogenesis, which is kind of a fun fact to share with folks. But ultimately, you lose neurons, you diminish capacity to send nerve impulses to and from the brain. So that myelination that we have that essentially aids in the conductivity of the neurons to send and receive signals, that slowly degrades over time as well. Diminished ability to process information, again, that could be a result of fewer cell bodies or even decreased myelination. Decreased conduction velocity, again, myelination is important. Slowing of voluntary motor movements, increased reflex time, so you don't necessarily get that real quick response that we saw when we were as young as we all were. And then degenerative changes in vision, hearing, sight, taste, smell, touch, and balance. It essentially just comes down to the death of neurons, the loss of some of those axonal pathways, the loss of myelination, maybe the loss of some of the receptors on the surface of some of these cells. But again, essentially everything just starts to slow down over time and breaks down. Okay, this is such an abbreviated list of disorders. Okay, so cerebrocardiovascular accident is one instance of a disorder. That's a stroke. Now, a stroke essentially can, there are a couple different things that a stroke can do. A stroke can essentially lead to loss of blood flow, aka oxygenation and glucose to specific regions of the brain. That's one thing that strokes can do. Strokes can also cause a break in the vasculature, aka blood. Blood gets into regions of the brain, and that is not good. The brain does not like that. If blood gets where it's not supposed to be, that can actually be cytotoxic and cause neuronal death. So that's bad as well. So there are a couple different things that strokes can do to a brain. It also depends on where the stroke is. We talked a lot about how there are the different layers of the meninges. You can have strokes that occur within the meningeal layers, like you could have a subdural hematoma, or, so again, this is a very abbreviated list of disorders. Transient ischemic attack, again, that's lack of oxygen to a region of the brain. There's a lot of different things that could cause a transient ischemic attack. But again, the brain needs glucose and the brain needs oxygen. And if you deprive it of either of those things, you're going to lead to neuronal cell death. Alzheimer's disease, very briefly. Again, this is probably one of the top neurological disorders that there are. Alzheimer's disease is the loss of cell bodies kind of uniformly. If you look at an Alzheimer's brain postmortem, you see a loss of all of cerebral sulci and gyri, so the brain actually shrinks to a certain extent. The origin or the reasoning for Alzheimer's disease has not been exactly determined yet. There are things called beta amyloid plaques, which is a buildup of protein that causes the cells to die. But in terms of exactly why that happens, has not been determined. There's a lot of, interestingly enough, there are a lot of different causes to Alzheimer's. There's not just one. There's some instances of mutations that cause Alzheimer's disease. There are instances of people who inherit genetic predispositions for Alzheimer's disease. And then there are some forms of Alzheimer's that are a result of an environmental exposure. So it just could be a whole variety of things. We're definitely not hitting on a lot of different things here. There's Parkinson's, there's Hodgkin's lymphoma, there's meningitis. There is like so many different disorders of the nervous system we could be talking about right now. But again, this is kind of the limit that your textbook goes over. If anybody is interested in talking about other disorders of the nervous system, happy to do it. The fourth leading nervous system disorder is epilepsy, and that's a neuronal misfiring or essentially seizures that occur. And again, those are very individualistic, very idiopathic, and meaning that they don't necessarily know the origin. So I guess the long and short of it is that neurological disorders are incredibly complex given the degree of complexity of the nervous system. And so there's still a lot of research that's being done to figure out how to quell or solve or to cure nervous system diseases. So if this is an area of interest of yours, by all means, continue to follow that pathway, because especially with our increasingly aged population, there is a ton of interest in figuring out how do we mitigate some of the deficiencies of the nervous system as we get older. So that's all I have for you. This is my last lecture. It's making me a little sad, but I'll be seeing you more in class. And so if you have any questions about any of this material, reach out, let me know, and I'm always happy to have a longer discussion with you. Bye. Oh, it does make me so sad.